as Dan mentioned, I'm Paul Guppy, Vice President for Research. Also, I have one correction to what Dan said. He meant to say that this is brilliantly edited by me. Make sure I get the record straight on that. But what I'm going to talk about tonight briefly is about education policy. As Dan mentioned again, because of our capital campaign, we have been able to invest that essentially in the intellectual capacity of our organization centered on issue centers, and one of those is a Center for Education Reform. And it's headed up by a very driven and dynamic woman, Lee Finna, who just happens to be out of town this week, so I'm going to be presenting her research. And in looking at education policy, I'll basically do it in 3 parts. First is to just give you an overview of public education in Washington State so you can get a general idea of what the system is like. And then our critique, I guess, of what the major impediments or problems are with public education. It all seen through the lens of educating children. So that might sound obvious, but it's amazing that in the policy world, how little this point comes up, which is how are children learning on the ground, in the classroom, in school. So that's our complete focus of the Education Center. Lee spends all of her time analyzing education policy from that point of view, our children learning. Everything else is secondary to that. And again, that may seem obvious, but when I get into describing how the system works, you'll quickly see that priorities don't always work out that way. And then the third section I'll touch on is our positive, proactive solutions. Because again, it's so easy for an independent group like ours on the outside to be critical of what the government or policymakers are doing without actually offering positive solutions. And when I get to that part, the background for that is all of our solutions are based on practical, real-world realities, often experiences that come from other states or from the private sector, not pie-in-the-sky ideas that we've invented, but solutions or policies that have been proven to work in other places. So I'll describe how that works. So first, an overview of the public education system. There are, most of you, I'm sure probably know, there are 6.2 million people live in our state. About 1 million of those are children in public schools. So the public school system is educating about a little over 1 million kids. An additional roughly 100,000 kids are either homeschooled or in private school or have some alternate arrangement. And that ratio is about the same, about the same across the country. Roughly 90% of American kids are in public education, about 10% are in other education. There are a little over 290 school districts in the state. Each of those districts has a board and a superintendent, and then below that are principals who run the actual schools. And then, of course, at the very top of that organizational structure is the superintendent of public instruction. And it is a fairly rigid, top-down organizational system. I mean, the legislature enacts policies, the superintendent of public instruction has his own initiatives, and then those are kind of filtered down from the top. On the budget side, we're spending, in the next 2-year budget cycle, roughly, and these are all in round numbers, so I won't bore you with a lot of statistics, about $15 billion to run the public education system. So you can think of, we're spending $15 billion to educate 1 million kids. Another way to look at that, again in round numbers, is we spend about $10,000, $9,500 or $10,000 per child per year on education. A little bit of historical perspective, we found that the proportion of children in relation to the total population is actually shrinking. And so that makes sense because people are having fewer kids, families are smaller. So if you started from, and we just picked one arbitrarily, 1980 to today, so that's about 25 years plus, the number of kids in public schools has increased about 25%, but the population of the state has almost doubled. It's increased more like 75%. We've also found that the size of the public education system and its budget and personnel has grown commensurate with the tax base or the population, but it has not grown in relation to the kids. So that's how you end up with, again, from our perspective, every time I talk about public school financing, we usually operate in an atmosphere that schools don't have enough money, they're always short. Washington Policy Center comes along and says, you know, it looks like we're spending plenty of money. So I understand that there's often disagreement about whether we're spending enough on public education. That's a whole discussion all by itself. But when we look at the historical perspective and the dollars per child adjusted for inflation, we see nothing but increasing trends. So, and then moving on to problems that we've seen in the public education system, and I brought a demonstration which will show what we think the problem is, and that's this. This is the Common Schools Manual. And this is the full set of regulations, RCW, which is the state law, plus the Washington Administrative Code, and all of this applies to every single elementary and high school in the state, K-12 education. So you can imagine that your average principal is operating under this, okay? Now, you know, they don't have to read, memorize, and understand everything that's in there, but it will give you an idea of the sheer volume of regulations that apply to public schools. Another thing that Lee discovered from looking at the management of public schools is that the principal, contrary to the traditional understanding of what a principal is as an education leader, really, on the ground, controls very little of what happens inside their building. So 90 to 95% of the money that's spent in an elementary school is already predetermined by a formula, the legislature, the central office, the superintendent of public instruction. That applies to school hours, hiring and firing of the staff, the facilities that are available, the curriculum. And I could go into lots and lots of detail, but you get a general idea. So we see this as the primary impediment to educational leadership, innovation, creativity that you need that leads to what? Kids actually learning in the classroom, and that's the goal that we're trying to get to. So moving on to solutions. What we looked at is both other states. So more than 40 states allow charter schools. Our state does not. The District of Columbia has had a very successful experiment, which has been terminated by the current administration, but which allows kids in the worst schools to have vouchers to go to private schools. A little under 2,000 District of Columbia children are doing that right now. As I mentioned, the Obama administration has announced that that program won't be continued, but the 1,900 or so kids who do have the vouchers will be allowed to finish their education. So that, again, from a research point of view, that creates a model program in what is one of the worst school districts in the country, the District of Columbia. But you have this test group who by definition must be in the worst schools before they can get the voucher. And they got the voucher, some of them, and most of them went to private schools. The kids that have had the vouchers for the last 2 or 3 years are fully 1.5 grades ahead in reading than their peers who were left in the public system. In math, they're more than 1 grade ahead. So to us, that's a sign of success, and possibly that could maybe be replicated in other places. The other system that we looked at for comparison was sort of the obvious one, which is never discussed in the public area, and that is private schools. Now, usually private schools are written off like that doesn't count, it's apples and oranges comparison. Private schools I should say public schools have a much broader mission. They have to take every kid who shows up. They have special needs kids, they take foster kids, and that's all true. Also, when immigrant families come into the state, the first thing they do is they put their child in the public school, rather. So there are dozens of languages represented in different cultures. That's all true. And so you cannot make, again, as a researcher, a one-for-one comparison. The way that Leave approached it, excuse me, the way that Leave approached it is, what lessons can we learn? We're not saying that a public school has to operate like a private school. That doesn't make any sense. But what management techniques and policies are they using in the private school that would improve the quality of education in the public school? And I'll mention 2 or 3 of these. There's a long list. But most importantly, when we look at a private school, we see that the principal is in charge of everything that happens in the school. The principal determines when the school day starts, who is on the staff. The principal is able to weed out weak teachers, or at least not ask them to not return next year. Teacher surveys find, in fact, there was just a national survey from the Friedman Foundation, I can just mention this quickly, that they did a survey of public and private school teachers. They found that private school teachers are ahead in the following categories. They're much more satisfied with their jobs. This is compared to public schools. Private school teachers are more satisfied with their jobs, have more control over what they do in the classroom, have more influence over important school policies, are empowered better to keep order in the classroom, enjoy more support from administrators, suffer less burnout, which is fairly obvious. And there's also a phenomenon that Lee found of public school teachers taking a pay cut in order to accept a position in a private school. So again, you have this kind of talent drain into the private system. And then the other aspect is, that she's talked about, is that funding in private schools, because of their mechanism, automatically follows the child. So when the parent is dissatisfied with whatever's happening, they don't even need a reason. They just simply shift their child out to another school. She also noticed that school choice exists in the public system in a sense, and it's called the real estate market. So people are choosing where they live based on the school district. This just happened with Secretary of Education Arnie Duncan. He was quoted in the paper, "Why did you and your wife buy a house in Northern Virginia? We like the public schools." As Secretary of Education, he really doesn't have an option about putting his kids in private school. I suppose he could, but his position is so visible, okay, that his kids are going to go to Arlington or Alexandria public schools, the ones in Northern Virginia. And of course, as we all know, the president's 2 girls go to a private school. And so the last point I'll make on that score is in Seattle in particular has one of the highest rates of private school participation. So here even liberal, big spending Seattle votes for every school building that comes along. Over a third of kids in Seattle go to private schools. So there's a disconnect between what choices the parents are making. And I'll close with that. We can go on to the next one and I can answer questions on education as we move on.